A judge forces an 80-year-old veteran to remove his medal, right there in open court. The man's only crime? Wearing a symbol of honor for the friends he lost in war. But what happens next doesn't just stir outrage, it rips open a secret buried for decades. This judge didn't just humiliate a hero, he humiliated the man who once saved his father's life. As the truth starts to unravel, powerful people panic, and a forgotten act of bravery becomes the one thing that could bring an empire crashing down. Before we dive into today's story, I'd love to know where you are watching from. Seeing your comments really reminds me why I do this every day. Franco Hank Brennan stood before his bedroom mirror, his weathered hands carefully pinning the Bronze Star medal to his navy blue civilian jacket. The morning sunlight caught the medal, making it gleam against the fabric. Every morning for the past 45 years, he had performed this same ritual with reverence and precision. His fingers trembled slightly as he adjusted the medal, but his eyes remained clear and focused. In the reflection, he saw not just himself, but the faces of his brothers in arms who never made it home from Vietnam. Their memories lived on through this small piece of metal and ribbon, a symbol of that terrible day when he'd led 12 men to safety through enemy fire. "This is for you, boys," he whispered, as he did every morning. His voice was soft, but carried the weight of decades of remembrance. Hank grabbed his car keys from the ceramic bowl by the front door, the one his granddaughter Rebecca had made for him in high school, and headed out to his well-maintained but aging Buick. The morning air was crisp, and the metal felt solid against his chest, a familiar comfort as he prepared to face what should have been a simple court appearance for a minor traffic violation. As he drove toward the municipal courthouse, his mind drifted back to that sweltering day in 1968. The jungle had been thick with fog and fear, and the sound of gunfire had filled the air. Among the 12 men he'd saved was a young Private Peter Whitmore, who had later died in a different battle. The memory was still sharp, unlike some of his more recent ones that seemed to slip away like water through his fingers. The courthouse parking lot was already filling up when Hank arrived. He took his time walking up the granite steps, his posture military straight despite his 80 years. The security guards nodded respectfully at the sight of his medal, one of them offering a crisp, "Good morning, sir." Inside the courtroom, Hank settled onto one of the hard wooden benches, his hands folded neatly in his lap. The court reporter, Lisa Lopez, was already at her station, organizing her materials with quiet efficiency. She glanced up, offering a gentle smile as she noticed the distinguished elderly veteran with the medal on his chest. When Judge Preston Whitmore swept into the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted noticeably. His expensive suit and carefully styled hair spoke of ambition and privilege, but there was something cold in his eyes that made Hank sit up straighter. The judge's gaze swept across the room, landing on Hank's medal. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and his lips pressed into a thin line. Lisa Lopez noticed the judge's reaction, her fingers pausing over her stenotype machine. She'd worked with Judge Whitmore long enough to recognize when something had gotten under his carefully maintained facade of authority. As the morning proceedings began, Hank sat quietly, watching the judge's demeanor grow increasingly tense each time his eyes fell on the Bronze Star. The medal seemed to bother him in a way that went beyond mere irritation. There was something personal in his barely concealed disdain. Hank's thoughts drifted again to young Peter Whitmore, and suddenly the connection clicked into place. The judge's features were remarkably similar to those of the young private he'd saved all those years ago. This must be Peter's son, the one who'd avoided service himself, according to the stories that had circulated among veterans in their small community. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Hank. Here he sat, wearing the medal he'd earned saving the judge's father, while that same man's son looked at him with barely disguised contempt. But Hank held his head high, his dignity intact. The medal wasn't about glory or recognition. It was about honor, sacrifice, and the sacred duty to remember. Lisa Lopez continued to observe the subtle drama unfolding before her, her experienced hands recording every word of the proceedings, while her mind noted the growing tension between the elderly veteran and the increasingly agitated judge. She had seen Judge Whitmore's arrogance many times before, but there was something different about his reaction to this particular defendant and his medal. As Hank waited for his case to be called, he sat straight-backed and calm, the medal catching the fluorescent light of the courtroom. Each glint was a reminder of why he wore it. Not for himself, but for those who never had the chance to grow old, to see their children grow up, to live the lives they'd sacrificed for others. The medal was his promise to them, a daily testament that they would not be forgotten. The morning continued, heavy. Judge Whitmore's gavel cracked against the wooden block, silencing the low murmur of the courtroom. "Mr. Franco Brennan," he called out, his voice carrying an edge that made several people shift uncomfortably in their seats. Hank rose slowly, his posture straight despite his years. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge's eyes fixed on the bronze star, his lip curling slightly. "Mr. Brennan, I notice you're wearing what appears to be a military decoration on your jacket." "Yes, Your Honor. It's my Bronze Star Medal." "Remove it," Judge Whitmore ordered curtly. A confused silence fell over the courtroom. Hank blinked, certain he had misheard. "I'm sorry, Your Honor." "The medal, Mr. Brennan. Remove it. It's inappropriate courtroom attire and disrespectful to the dignity of this court." The judge's words carried a sharp, dismissive tone that made several observers wince. Lisa Lopez's hands froze over her stenotype machine. Slowly, making sure her movements weren't obvious, she reached for her phone and began recording. What she was witnessing felt wrong on every level. "Your Honor," Hank began, his voice steady but gentle, "this medal represents the sacrifice of my fellow soldiers in Vietnam. I wear it to honor their memory." "I didn't ask for a history lesson, Mr. Brennan," Judge Whitmore interrupted, his voice rising. "This is a court of law, not a veterans parade. Remove the medal immediately." Hank's weathered hands moved to his chest, touching the medal that had been his daily companion for 45 years. "Sir, with all due respect, this medal was awarded for saving 12 men, including—" "Are you refusing to comply with the direct order from this court?" Whitmore's face had grown red, his carefully maintained composure cracking. "Perhaps you think your military service puts you above the law?" The gallery watched in stunned silence. A young lawyer at the defense table looked down at his papers, unable to watch. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably, his own service pins glinting on his uniform. "No, Your Honor," Hank replied quietly. "I would never claim to be above the law. I just wish to explain." "The only thing you need to explain is why you continue to defy this court." Whitmore's voice boomed through the room. "Your self-aggrandizing display is a mockery of these proceedings. Remove that medal now, or I will find you in contempt." Lisa's phone continued recording as she watched Hank's face. The elderly veteran's expression remained dignified, but his eyes reflected a deep hurt that made her throat tight. She could see his hands trembling more noticeably now, whether from age or emotion, she couldn't tell. "You know nothing about sacrifice," Whitmore continued, his words dripping with disdain. "Parading around with a piece of metal, playing the hero? This isn't some American Legion hall where you can swap war stories. This is my courtroom." A small gasp rippled through the gallery at the judge's cruel words. Hank stood perfectly still, his face pale but composed. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly in the silent courtroom. "Your father would have disagreed, Your Honor." Judge Whitmore's face went from red to white in an instant. "How dare you?" he hissed. "One more word about my father, and I'll have you arrested. Remove that medal, now." Hank's hands moved slowly to his jacket. His fingers, trembling visibly now, struggled with the pin. Each movement seemed to pain him, not physically, but deep in his soul. The bronze star, which had caught the morning light so proudly earlier, now seemed to dim as he carefully unpinned it. Lisa Lopez's phone captured every moment. The tremor in Hank's hands, the cruel twist of the judge's mouth, the shocked faces of the observers. She knew what she was doing could cost her her job, but something told her this moment needed to be preserved. Hank held the medal in his palm for a moment, looking down at it with eyes that seemed to see beyond the present moment, perhaps back to that day in the jungle when he'd earned it. Then, with careful movements, he placed it in his jacket pocket. "Are you satisfied, Your Honor?" he asked quietly, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. Judge Whitmore's response was cold and clipped. "Let's proceed with your traffic violation, Mr. Brennan, unless you have any other theatrical displays planned." The elderly veteran stood straight, his empty lapel a glaring absence in the fluorescent lighting of the courtroom. His hands, still shaking, came to rest at his sides as he faced the judge who had stripped him of not just his medal, but a piece of his daily tribute to fallen comrades. The courtroom remained silent, heavy with the weight of the injustice they had just witnessed. Lisa Lopez's finger hovered over the stop button on her phone, making sure to capture every second of the horrible scene that had just unfolded. Lisa Lopez sat at her Kit Lopez table that evening, staring at her phone. Her hands trembled slightly as she uploaded the video to social media. "Judge humiliates elderly Bronze Star recipient in court," she typed as the caption, adding a few relevant hashtags. After a moment's hesitation, her finger pressed post. She had watched the video dozens of times already, and each viewing made her stomach churn. The audio was crystal clear. Judge Whitmore's cruel words, Hank's dignified responses, the shocked silence of the courtroom. She knew posting it might cost her her job, but she couldn't stay silent. By morning, the video had exploded. 10,000 shares became 100,000. News websites began embedding it in their articles. Local stations called her phone repeatedly, seeking comments. Her inbox filled with messages from veterans groups and concerned citizens. "This is Christine Martinez, reporting live from outside the county courthouse," a reporter announced on the morning news. Behind her, a group of veterans had gathered, many wearing their own service medals in solidarity. The video showing Judge Preston Whitmore ordering an 80-year-old Vietnam veteran to remove his Bronze Star medal has sparked nationwide outrage. The American Legion released a statement condemning the judge's actions. The treatment of Sergeant First Class Franco Brennan represents a shocking display of disrespect toward our veterans and the sacrifices they've made, their spokesperson declared during a press conference. Rather than apologizing, Judge Whitmore appeared on a local news program that evening. He sat stiffly in the interview chair, his expression stern. "My courtroom maintains certain standards of decorum," he stated firmly. "Military decorations, while admirable in their proper context, are not appropriate attire for legal proceedings." The interviewer leaned forward. "But sir, many viewers found your tone and words unnecessarily harsh, especially given Mr. Brennan's age and service record." Whitmore's jaw tightened. Age and past service do not exempt anyone from following courtroom protocol. Mr. Brennan was being deliberately provocative. Social media erupted with fresh anger at his response. "Veterans deserve better" began trending nationwide. Military forums filled with stories from veterans who had worn their medals to court without issue. Photos circulated of other judges, many veterans themselves, wearing service pins on their robes. Lisa's phone buzzed with a text from her sister. "Turn on Channel 5 right now." A panel discussion was in progress. "This isn't about courtroom protocol," a retired military judge was saying. "I've presided over thousands of cases. Never once did I consider a service medal disruptive or disrespectful. This is about something else entirely." The discussion turned to Judge Whitmore's background. "Sources tell us his father was a decorated Vietnam veteran," another panelist added. "There seems to be some personal history here that may have influenced his reaction." Whitmore scheduled another interview, this time with a more sympathetic host. "My father's service record has nothing to do with this," he insisted, though his voice carried a slight tremor. "This is about maintaining the dignity of our legal system. The media is trying to twist this into something it's not." But the public wasn't buying it. veterans began showing up at his courtroom, wearing their medals. Each time, Whitmore had them removed by security, which only fueled the growing outrage. Lisa watched as her video continued to spread. Major networks picked it up, running it alongside interviews with military experts and legal scholars. All of them condemned Whitmore's behavior. "What we witnessed in that video was an abuse of power," a prominent legal expert declared on a national morning show. Judge Whitmore didn't just disrespect a veteran, he violated the basic principles of judicial conduct. Veterans organizations across the country began calling for Whitmore's removal from the bench. The Veterans of Foreign Wars issued a scathing statement. Judge Whitmore's actions and his subsequent attempts to justify them demonstrate a clear bias against veterans that makes him unfit to serve as a judge. Still, Whitmore refused to back down. He appeared on a conservative talk show, attempting to reframe the narrative. "This is about order in our courts," he insisted. "The radical left is trying to undermine our judicial system by promoting chaos and disorder." The host, usually sympathetic to authority figures, pushed back. "But Judge, surely there's a difference between maintaining order and humiliating an elderly war hero." Whitmore's face reddened. Mr. Brennan was not humiliated. He was asked to follow the same rules as everyone else. This manufactured outrage is politically motivated. The clip of his defensive response went viral, generating even more backlash. Legal blogs began digging into his past rulings, finding a pattern of harsh treatment toward veterans in his courtroom. Lisa watched it all unfold from her desk at the courthouse, where she continued her duties despite the growing tension. She noticed how other court employees avoided Whitmore's gaze, how attorneys whispered about him in the hallways. The judge's demeanor grew more rigid with each passing day. His face appeared increasingly strained, his movements tense. Yet he continued to defend his actions, giving interview after interview, each one digging him deeper into his position. "I stand by my decision," he declared to a room full of reporters. "The integrity of our courts must be maintained, regardless of public sentiment or social media pressure." But the pressure kept mounting. Veterans groups organized protests outside the courthouse. Military families shared stories of their loved ones' sacrifices. The video of Hank Brennan's quiet dignity in the face of Whitmore's cruelty continued to circulate, a powerful testament to the gap between the judge's claims of propriety and the reality of his actions. Through it all, Judge Whitmore remained unmoved, his refusal to acknowledge any wrongdoing becoming as much a part of the story as his original actions. Each defensive statement, each attempted justification, only served to fuel the growing storm of public outrage. Judge Whitmore sat in his chambers, his face flushed with anger as he reviewed the legal document before him. His hand trembled slightly as he signed the restraining order with an aggressive flourish. The document specifically prohibited Franco Brennan from wearing any military decorations, medals, or insignia within 50 feet of his courtroom. "This should put an end to this circus," he muttered, pressing his official seal onto the paper with unnecessary force. The next morning, 2 court officers appeared at Hank's modest home. The elderly veteran opened the door, already dressed in his usual jacket, with the bronze star pinned carefully to the lapel. His weathered hands accepted the thick envelope as the officers explained its contents. Alone in his living room, Hank struggled to make sense of the legal jargon. The words seemed to swim before his eyes, more confusing than usual. He recognized enough to understand that Judge Whitmore was trying to strip away the one daily ritual that kept him connected to his fallen brothers. "This isn't right," he whispered to himself, but the words felt distant, disconnected. His mind began to drift, memories of Vietnam mixing with the present moment. The document in his hands transformed into field orders, then back again. The room started to spin. Hank stood up, trying to steady himself. He needed to call someone, his daughter maybe? But who was his daughter? For a terrifying moment, he couldn't remember her name. The walls of his home felt unfamiliar, threatening. Where was his unit? Where were his men? "Lieutenant Thompson?" he called out, his voice shaking. Lieutenant Thompson had died in 1968, but in Hank's confused state, he was certain his commanding officer was just in the next room. "We need to move out. The enemy is—" His legs gave way. Hank collapsed onto the carpet, the restraining order scattering across the floor. The bronze star on his jacket caught the morning light, glinting like a farewell signal. Next door, Sarah Martinez was watering her garden when she heard the thump through the thin walls. She had been keeping an eye on Hank ever since his wife passed 3 years ago. Something about the sound made her drop her watering can. "Mr. Brennan?" she called, hurrying to his front door. When no one answered, she used the spare key he had given her for emergencies. "Hank?" She found him unconscious on the living room floor, mumbling incoherently about battlefield coordinates and lost soldiers. Sarah's hands shook as she dialed 911. "Please hurry," she pleaded into the phone. "He's not making any sense. Something's very wrong." The ambulance arrived within minutes, its sirens piercing the quiet suburban street. The paramedics worked quickly, their faces grave as they assessed his condition. Hank drifted in and out of consciousness, past and present blurring together in his mind. "Blood pressure's elevated," one paramedic reported. "Possible stress-induced episode. We need to get him to County General." In the emergency room, Dr. Rachel Lopez examined Hank while reviewing his medical history. "Early-stage dementia," she noted, frowning at his vital signs. "The recent stress appears to have triggered a severe episode. Has he experienced any unusual emotional trauma lately?" Sarah Martinez, who had followed the ambulance to the hospital, explained about the courtroom incident and showed the doctor the viral video on her phone. Dr. Lopez's expression darkened as she watched Judge Whitmore berate the elderly veteran. "This kind of public humiliation can be devastating for dementia patients," she explained. "Their cognitive function often depends on familiar routines and emotional stability. Breaking those routines, especially in such a traumatic way, can accelerate their decline." More tests confirmed the doctor's fears. The stress had indeed worsened Hank's condition. His confusion lingered, and he had difficulty recognizing even familiar faces. The hospital staff found him several times wandering the corridors, looking for his combat unit. "Where's Lieutenant Thompson?" he would ask, his eyes distant. "We have to save those men. We have to." The nurses would gently guide him back to his room, their hearts breaking at the sight of this decorated veteran lost in his memories of war. The Bronze Star Medal, which someone had carefully removed from his jacket, sat on his bedside table, a silent witness to his current struggle. Dr. Lopez documented everything meticulously, noting how the stress of Judge Whitmore's actions had directly contributed to Hank's deterioration. "The emotional trauma of the courtroom incident, compounded by this restraining order, has significantly impacted his cognitive function," she wrote in her medical report. "The patient's condition has advanced months, possibly years, beyond where it would normally be at this stage." Sarah Martinez sat by Hank's bed, holding his hand as he slept fitfully. She found herself thinking about the restraining order scattered across his living room floor, about the cruelty of a judge who would deliberately harm an elderly veteran already fighting his own private battle with time and memory. "Don't worry, Mr. Brennan," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "We won't let him win. We won't let him take away your dignity." But Hank was lost in his memories, reliving moments from 50 years ago, his mind trying to escape the pain of the present by retreating into the past. The bronze star on his bedside table caught the fluorescent hospital lights, its surface reflecting the face of a hero who had saved 12 men in combat, now brought low by the very system he had fought to protect. Rebecca Brennan rushed through the hospital corridors, her worn briefcase clutched tightly against her chest. She had left the public defender's office the moment she got Sarah Martinez's call, not even bothering to reschedule her afternoon appointments. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she followed the room numbers until she reached 215. She paused in the doorway, her heart clenching at the sight before her. Her grandfather, usually so strong and dignified, looked small and fragile in the hospital bed. His silver hair was disheveled, and his hands moved restlessly across the blanket as if searching for something. "Grandpa?" she said softly, stepping into the room. Hank's eyes opened, but the confusion in them made Rebecca's throat tight. He stared at her for a long moment before recognition slowly dawned. "Rebecca?" His voice was uncertain. "Is that you? We need to move out soon. The lieutenant says..." "It's me, Grandpa." She hurried to his bedside, taking his hand. "You're in the hospital. You're safe." Sarah Martinez, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, stood up. "He's been like this since we found him. Sometimes he knows where he is, but mostly..." She trailed off, gesturing helplessly. Rebecca listened as Sarah explained everything. The viral video of Judge Whitmore humiliating her grandfather, the restraining order, finding him collapsed and confused in his living room. With each detail, Rebecca's anger grew, but so did her sense of powerlessness. "I brought some of his things from home," Sarah said, pointing to a canvas bag near the bed. "I thought familiar objects might help." Rebecca nodded gratefully and began going through the bag. She pulled out his favorite sweater, the photo of her grandmother that usually sat by his bed, and a worn leather folder she had never seen before. The folder was stuffed with yellowed papers, many bearing official military seals. "What's this?" she murmured, opening it carefully. "Your service records?" Hank suddenly asked clearly, his eyes focusing on the folder. "Keep those safe. They're important." Rebecca began reading through the documents, her legal training helping her navigate the military terminology. There were deployment orders, commendations, and then, her breath caught, the Bronze Star citation. The official document detailed events from April 12, 1968. Her grandfather's unit had been ambushed in the Quang Tri province. Under heavy enemy fire, Sergeant First Class Franco Brennan had led a rescue mission to save a dozen trapped soldiers, including Private James Whitmore. "Private James Whitmore?" Rebecca whispered, her mind racing. "Could he be..." She read on, her hands trembling slightly. The citation described how her grandfather had made 3 separate trips into the kill zone, dragging wounded men to safety while taking fire. The last soldier he saved, Private Whitmore, had been critically wounded. Hank had carried him over half a mile to the evacuation point, using his own body to shield the injured man from enemy bullets. "Grandpa," she said, looking up at him with new understanding, "you never told me about this." Hank's eyes cleared for a moment. "Some things are hard to talk about, sweetheart. But those men, they were my responsibility. Every one of them had families waiting back home." "Including Private Whitmore?" "Jimmy," Hank nodded. Then his expression grew confused again. "Is he here? We need to get him to the medic." Rebecca gently squeezed his hand, fighting back tears. "He's safe, Grandpa. You saved him." She continued reading through the records, finding after-action reports and letters of commendation. One letter was from James Whitmore himself, written from a military hospital, thanking Sergeant Brennan for saving his life and promising to name his firstborn son after him. "Preston," Hank suddenly said clearly. He named the boy Preston. Rebecca's head snapped up. "Judge Preston Whitmore? He's James Whitmore's son?" But Hank had drifted again, his eyes distant as he mumbled about patrol schedules and enemy movements. Rebecca sat back in her chair, the military records spread across her lap, feeling the weight of what she had discovered. Her grandfather, this quiet, humble man who had raised her after her parents died, was a genuine hero. He had saved 12 men, including the father of the very judge who had humiliated him. The irony of it made her chest ache. Dr. Lopez entered the room, checking Hank's vital signs. "The stress of recent events has significantly accelerated his condition," she explained quietly to Rebecca. "The confusion and disorientation may improve with rest, but the damage..." "It's permanent?" Rebecca asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We'll know more in time." But he needs peace and stability right now. No more emotional trauma. Rebecca looked at the Bronze Star Medal on the bedside table, then at her grandfather's face. The man who had risked his life to save others, who had carried wounded soldiers through gunfire, now lay vulnerable and confused because of one judge's cruelty. She began carefully organizing the military records, her legal mind already forming strategies. As a public defender, she had learned to fight against long odds, to stand up for those who couldn't defend themselves. Now her grandfather needed that same dedication. "I won't let them do this to you, Grandpa," she promised softly, watching as he finally drifted into peaceful sleep. "I'll find a way to make this right." The bronze star caught the light as she spoke, its surface gleaming like a beacon of truth, waiting to be revealed. Rebecca placed the military records carefully back in their folder, knowing they contained not just the story of her grandfather's heroism, but perhaps also the key to protecting his dignity. Rebecca spread the military documents across her Kit Lopez table, the lamp casting a warm glow over the yellowed pages. She had brought copies home from the hospital, needing a quiet place to piece together her grandfather's story. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, forgotten as she lost herself in the details of that fateful day in 1968. The Bronze Star citation painted a vivid picture. On April 12th, her grandfather's unit had been providing security for a medical evacuation team near the Quang Tri province when they were caught in a devastating ambush. The enemy had positioned themselves in the surrounding hills, trapping the American soldiers in a deadly crossfire. Her fingers traced the typed words, "Sergeant First Class Franco Brennan, displaying extraordinary courage and disregard for his own safety, made multiple trips through intense enemy fire to rescue wounded personnel." The official report listed all 12 soldiers her grandfather had saved. Rebecca's heart nearly stopped when she reached the 10th name. Private Peter Whitmore, Medical Corps. "Peter Whitmore," she whispered, grabbing her laptop. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she searched through public records. Birth certificates, death notices, family announcements. The pieces started falling into place. Peter Whitmore had survived Vietnam, returning home to become a respected doctor. He had married in 1972 and had one son in 1978, Preston James Whitmore, named in part after the man who had saved his father's life. "Oh my God," Rebecca breathed, sitting back in her chair. The judge, who had humiliated her grandfather, who had stripped him of his dignity and triggered his collapse, owed his very existence to Hank Brennan's courage. She found more documents, letters Peter Whitmore had written to her grandfather over the years. The early ones were filled with gratitude, describing his recovery, his medical school graduation, his wedding. But they stopped abruptly in 1985. An obituary explained why. Peter Whitmore had died in a car accident when Preston was just 7 years old. Rebecca felt a twinge of sympathy for the young boy who had lost his father, but it didn't excuse the man he had become. Across town, in an upscale restaurant's private dining room, Judge Preston Whitmore sat across from Leto Caldwell, his wine glass untouched. The real estate developer's expensive suit couldn't hide his growing agitation. "This veteran's controversy needs to go away, Preston," Caldwell said, his manicured fingers drumming on the white tablecloth. "I need those permits for the River Heights project approved next month. We can't afford any delays or extra scrutiny." Whitmore straightened his tie, a nervous habit he had never managed to break. "The media attention will die down. These social media storms always do." "Not fast enough." Caldwell leaned forward, his voice dropping. "That project represents $300 million in development. The investors are getting nervous about all this negative publicity around you. They're questioning whether you can still deliver." "I've never failed to deliver," Whitmore snapped, then quickly lowered his voice. "The permits will be approved. The environmental impact reports have already been adjusted. Everything is in place." Caldwell's eyes narrowed. "Then handle this veteran situation. Now, I don't care how you do it, but make it go away. Your political future depends on it." Remember who funded your judicial campaign. He's just some old man with a medal, Whitmore said, but his voice lacked conviction. The public backlash had been intense, far worse than he had anticipated. The restraining order will keep him in line. An old man who's become a symbol, Caldwell corrected. Veterans groups are organizing protests. Local news stations are running special reports on military decorations and courtroom protocols. The governor's office called me today, Preston. They're concerned. Whitmore felt the familiar knot of resentment tightening in his chest. Ever since childhood, he had lived in the shadow of military service. His father's sacrifice, his father's courage, his father's dedication to duty. Even after death, Peter Whitmore's legacy had haunted his son, carrying expectations that Preston had never wanted to fulfill. "I'll handle it," he assured Caldwell, though he had no idea how. The situation had spiraled far beyond a simple courtroom confrontation. "You better," Caldwell warned, signaling for the check, "because if this delays the River Heights project, you'll be looking for a new career, and it won't be in politics." Back in her Kit Lopez, Rebecca gathered the documents with trembling hands. The evidence was clear. Her grandfather had risked his life repeatedly that day in Vietnam, running through enemy fire to drag wounded men to safety. The last rescue, Peter Whitmore, had been the most dangerous. The citation described how Hank had shielded the wounded medic with his own body during the half-mile trek to the evacuation point. She thought of her grandfather lying confused in his hospital bed, his memories fractured by dementia and stress. The man who had shown such extraordinary courage, who had saved the father of the very judge who now tormented him, deserved better than this. Rebecca pulled out her phone and began making calls. She had contacts in the media, other lawyers who might help, veterans advocacy groups. The truth about Judge Whitmore's connection to Hank Brennan needed to come out. Her grandfather had risked everything to save Peter Whitmore. Now she would risk everything to save his dignity. The courthouse steps were a sea of military uniforms. Hundreds of veterans had gathered, their signs and banners waving in the morning breeze. "Respect our heroes and honor the Bronze Star," read the larger placards, while others carried photos of Hank in his younger days, serving in Vietnam. Rebecca watched from across the street as news vans lined the curb. National networks had picked up the story, their cameras capturing the growing crowd of protesters. A group of Vietnam veterans led the demonstration, their weathered faces stern with determination. "This is bigger than I expected," said James Martinez, a fellow public defender who had been helping Rebecca dig through court records. He handed her a thick manila folder. "But what's in here might be even bigger." Inside her office, Rebecca spread the documents across her desk, page after page of court decisions, all involving Leto Caldwell's development projects, property disputes, zoning changes, environmental challenges. Every ruling had gone in Caldwell's favor. "The pattern is impossible to miss," James explained, pointing to specific cases. "Environmental impact reports mysteriously changed. Key evidence disappeared. Witnesses suddenly changed their testimony." Rebecca nodded, her suspicions growing stronger. "And look at the timing. These rulings started right after Whitmore became judge, the same year Caldwell made massive donations to his judicial campaign." She pulled up bank records on her computer. Her friend at the FBI had come through with the financial documentation she needed. Here it is: regular deposits into an offshore account, always 48 hours after major rulings in Caldwell's favor. "That's the smoking gun," James said, leaning closer to study the screen. "But we need more. Something to connect it directly to Whitmore." Rebecca was about to respond when her phone buzzed. It was a text from her contact at the Vietnam Veterans Association. They had found something in their archives, documents from Peter Whitmore's personal effects donated after his death. An hour later, Rebecca sat in the Veterans Association office holding a yellowed envelope with trembling hands. The letter inside was dated June 15, 1968, typed on Army letterhead. Peter Whitmore's signature was bold at the bottom. "To Department of the Army Awards and Decorations Branch," she read aloud. Subject: Recommendation for Medal of Honor, Sergeant First Class Franco Brennan. The room seemed to grow very quiet as she continued reading. I write to recommend the highest possible recognition for the bravest man I have ever known. On April 12, 1968, during an enemy ambush near Quang Tri Province, Sergeant Brennan demonstrated valor far beyond any reasonable expectation of duty. Rebecca's voice caught as she read her grandfather's actions described in vivid detail. Peter Whitmore's words painted a picture even more dramatic than the Bronze Star citation. Despite severe wounds to his left arm and leg, Sergeant Brennan refused evacuation. Instead, he made 12 separate trips through concentrated enemy fire to rescue wounded personnel. During the final rescue, my own, he shielded my body with his own while crawling half a mile under constant sniper fire. When his wounds reopened, he used his own belt as a tourniquet on my leg, ignoring his injuries to ensure my survival. The letter continued, describing how Hank had organized the defensive position that ultimately saved the entire unit. His actions that day saved not just 12 lives, but inspired every soldier who witnessed his courage. The Bronze Star Medal he received, while honorable, does not adequately recognize the full scope of his heroism. Why wasn't this processed? Rebecca asked the archivist, who had been quietly watching her read. The elderly woman shook her head sadly. The letter was misrouted. By the time it reached the proper office, the awards window had closed. Peter Whitmore tried to resubmit it several times before his death, but the bureaucracy... She shrugged. Sometimes the greatest heroes go unrecognized. Rebecca carefully photocopied the letter, her mind racing with possibilities. This wasn't just a piece of history, it was ammunition. Judge Whitmore had humiliated a man who deserved the nation's highest military honor. A man who had saved his own father's life. Back at her office, she began organizing the evidence into two distinct files. The first contained all the proof of judicial corruption, bank records, suspicious rulings, campaign contributions, and documented meetings between Whitmore and Caldwell. The second file held her grandfather's military records, the newly discovered Medal of Honor recommendation, and Peter Whitmore's personal letters describing Hank's heroism. Together, they told a story of extraordinary courage and sacrifice, followed by decades of quiet dignity. Outside, the veterans' protests had grown even larger. Local businesses were providing free water and coffee to the demonstrators. More media trucks had arrived, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Rebecca watched through her window as a group of young Marines joined the protest, standing respectfully behind the Vietnam veterans. The sight strengthened her resolve. Her grandfather had risked everything to save others. Now it was her turn to fight for him. She picked up her phone and dialed the number for the State Attorney General's office. The evidence of judicial corruption would go to them first. Then, she would release Peter Whitmore's letter to the media, letting the world know exactly who Judge Whitmore had chosen to humiliate. As she waited for the call to connect, Rebecca looked at the photo on her desk. Her grandfather in his Army uniform, young and proud. The Bronze Star gleaming on his chest. The same medal that now sat in a drawer because of Judge Whitmore's cruelty. "Attorney General's office," a voice answered. Rebecca took a deep breath. "This is Rebecca Brennan. I need to report evidence of judicial misconduct and corruption, and I have quite a story to tell you." Rebecca sat in the dimly lit hospital room, watching her grandfather's chest rise and fall with each labored breath. The machines beeped steadily, their rhythmic sounds a constant reminder of his fragile condition. Hank's weathered hands, which had once carried wounded soldiers to safety, now lay motionless on the white hospital sheets. "Your blood pressure's still too high, Mr. Brennan," the nurse said softly, adjusting his medication. "Try to rest." Rebecca clutched a thick manila envelope containing all the evidence she'd gathered. The proof of Judge Whitmore's corruption felt heavy in her hands, matched only by the weight of the decision she faced. Her phone buzzed again, another message from Lito Caldwell's lawyers offering a settlement. They wanted to handle this quietly, to make it all go away with a generous check and a sealed agreement. The easy path was clear. Take the money, sign the papers, protect her grandfather from any more stress or public attention. The settlement would pay for the best medical care available and secure Hank's future. But as she watched him sleep, Rebecca remembered the stories she'd read in Peter Whitmore's letter. How her grandfather had crawled through gunfire again and again when the easy path would have been to save himself. How he'd worn his bronze star every day, not for personal glory, but to honor the memory of those who never came home. "What would you do, Grandpa?" she whispered, touching his hand gently. "Would you take the easy way out?" Hank stirred slightly, his eyes fluttering open. "Rebecca?" His voice was weak, but his gaze found her face. "Why aren't you at work?" "I'm working on something important," she said, squeezing his hand. "Something about justice." A faint smile crossed his lips. "Justice," he repeated softly. "That's worth fighting for." In that moment, Rebecca made her decision. She pulled out her phone and dialed the number for Channel 7 News, the largest network affiliate in the state. "This is Rebecca Brennan," she said firmly. "I have a story about judicial corruption and a Vietnam War hero that your viewers need to hear." The next morning, the story exploded across every major news outlet. Rebecca stood on the courthouse steps, surrounded by cameras and microphones, with veterans forming a protective circle around her. She held up Peter Whitmore's letter for the cameras. "Judge Preston Whitmore didn't just abuse his power by taking bribes," she announced, her voice carrying across the crowd. "He chose to humiliate a decorated war hero, the very man who saved his own father's life in Vietnam." The reporters pressed closer as Rebecca read from Peter Whitmore's letter, describing how Hank had carried 12 wounded soldiers to safety, including the judge's father. She detailed the recommended Medal of Honor that had been lost to bureaucracy, and how Peter Whitmore had called Hank the bravest man I ever knew. And how did Judge Whitmore repay this debt? Rebecca's voice grew stronger with controlled anger. "By forcing my grandfather to remove his Bronze Star, by issuing a restraining order against his military decorations, by treating a hero with contempt while accepting bribes to corrupt our justice system." She held up the financial records next. These documents prove that Judge Whitmore received regular payments through offshore accounts, always following favorable rulings for developer Leto Caldwell. While he was humiliating my grandfather in court, he was selling justice to the highest bidder. The crowd erupted with shouts of anger and support. Veterans stepped forward to share their own stories of Hank's character and service. News helicopters circled overhead, broadcasting the scene live across the state. At the hospital, nurses gathered around televisions in the break room, watching the story unfold. They took turns sitting with Hank, making sure he was shielded from any unnecessary stress while still keeping him informed of the support pouring in. By evening, the story had gone national. Military organizations from across the country issued statements condemning Judge Whitmore. The veterans of foreign wars announced plans to hold a ceremony honoring Hank's service, and a congressional representative called for a formal review of his Medal of Honor recommendation. Social media exploded with outrage. The video of Judge Whitmore forcing Hank to remove his Bronze Star was played side by side with photographs from Vietnam, showing a young Hank carrying wounded soldiers to safety. The contrast between his heroism and the judge's cruelty could not have been starker. Outside the hospital, a group of Marines in dress uniforms stood vigil, volunteering to protect Hank from any unwanted intrusion. They saluted every veteran who came to visit, maintaining a dignified presence that moved many observers to tears. Rebecca returned to her grandfather's room that evening, exhausted but determined. The state attorney general had announced a formal investigation into Judge Whitmore's conduct, and Leto Caldwell's development projects were being suspended pending review. "You did good, sweetheart," Hank said softly when she told him about the day's events. His color was better, and the nurses reported his blood pressure had stabilized. "Standing up for what's right, that's what really matters." Rebecca held his hand, noting how his fingers had regained some of their strength. "I learned that from you, Grandpa. You never took the easy path when people needed your help." A young Marine sergeant appeared in the doorway, standing at attention. "Sir," he addressed Hank, "the honor guard is ready whenever you feel strong enough. We'd like to escort you on your daily walk if you're willing." Hank's eyes brightened. On his bedside table, his Bronze Star medal caught the light, returned to its rightful place of honor. Outside, they could hear the sounds of supporters gathering, their presence a testament to the power of courage and truth over corruption and cruelty. Peter Whitmore sat in his wheelchair at Golden Meadows Nursing Home, his weathered hands trembling as he watched the television news coverage. The remote control clattered to the floor as he saw his son Preston's face appear on the screen, followed by footage of an elderly veteran being forced to remove his Bronze Star. "Dear God," Peter whispered, his voice breaking, "that's Hank Brennan." His nurse, Sarah Martinez, picked up the remote and turned up the volume. The news anchor was detailing how Judge Preston Whitmore had humiliated a decorated Vietnam War veteran, the very man who had saved his father's life during the war. "I need to go," Peter said, gripping the arms of his wheelchair. "I need to set this right." "Mr. Whitmore, you're not strong enough to—" Sarah began. "My strength doesn't matter anymore," Peter cut her off, his voice finding a firmness it hadn't held in years. "What matters is doing what's right. Hank Brennan carried me through hell when I couldn't walk. Now it's my turn to stand up for him." 2 days later, Peter Whitmore entered the courthouse, pushed in his wheelchair by Sarah. The marble halls were packed with reporters, veterans, and concerned citizens who had gathered for Judge Whitmore's emergency ethics hearing. The crowd parted respectfully as Peter made his way forward, many recognizing him from the old war photographs that had been circulating in the media. Inside the courtroom, Preston Whitmore sat at the defendant's table, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of strain. His eyes widened in shock as he saw his father enter. "Dad?" Preston stood up, his face paling. "What are you doing here?" Peter didn't acknowledge his son. Instead, he asked Sarah to wheel him to the witness stand. The room fell silent as he was sworn in, his right hand shaking but raised with determination. "Please state your name for the record," the ethics board chairman said. "Peter James Whitmore, former combat medic, United States Army." "Mr. Whitmore, can you tell us about your relationship with Sergeant First Class Franco Brennan?" Peter leaned forward, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "Hank Brennan is the reason I'm alive today. The reason my son grew up with a father." He paused, looking directly at Preston. "On April 12, 1968, our unit was ambushed in the Quang Tri province. I took shrapnel in both legs, couldn't move, couldn't run. The enemy was closing in." The courtroom was absolutely silent as Peter continued. "Hank Brennan came back for me. Not just for me, for all of us who were wounded. 12 men in total. He carried us one by one through enemy fire. I can still hear the bullets hitting the trees around us, still smell the cordite and the blood. But Hank never stopped, never hesitated." Tears rolled down Peter's cheeks as he spoke. "When it was my turn, I told him to leave me. The enemy was so close we could hear them shouting, but Hank just smiled and said, 'No man left behind, Doc.' He carried me over his shoulders for more than a mile, under constant fire. Saved my life. Saved all our lives." Preston Whitmore shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unable to meet his father's gaze. "And now," Peter's voice hardened, "I watch my own son, a judge who never served a day in uniform, humiliate this hero in his courtroom, force him to remove the medal he earned saving my life." He turned to face Preston directly. "You shame me, son. You shame everything I ever tried to teach you about honor and duty." Preston stood up, his face flushed. "Dad, you don't understand? The courtroom has rules." "Rules?" Peter's voice cracked like a whip. "You want to talk about rules while you're taking bribes from developers? I raised you better than this. Hank Brennan's courage gave you the chance to grow up with a father? And this is how you repay him? The elderly veteran's hands gripped his wheelchair arms tightly. I wrote a letter recommending Hank for the Medal of Honor. It got lost in the system, like so many things did in that war. But I never lost my gratitude, never lost my respect for what he did that day. Sarah stepped forward with a tissue, but Peter waved it away. I'm not here for sympathy. I'm here for justice. I'm here to tell this board and everyone in this room that my son has betrayed not just his oath as a judge, but the basic human decency that Hank Brennan showed when he risked his life for strangers. In the back of the courtroom, Lito Caldwell watched the proceedings with growing alarm. His carefully constructed world of influence and corruption was crumbling. He slipped out of the courtroom, pulling out his phone to make a call. Something had to be done about Rebecca Brennan before she could present the rest of her evidence. Peter wasn't finished. I want the record to show that I support the full investigation of my son's conduct. I support his removal from the bench. And I ask this board to consider that if Hank Brennan had shown the same lack of courage that my son has displayed, I wouldn't be here today to testify. Preston Whitmore slumped in his chair, decades of carefully constructed prestige and power dissolving under his father's words. The ethics board members exchanged glances, their expressions grave. One last thing, Peter said, his voice growing tired but determined. I want to apologize personally to Sergeant Brennan for my son's actions. The man who saved my life deserved better from my family, much better. As Sarah wheeled him from the witness stand, Peter stopped his wheelchair beside Preston's table. Father and son locked eyes for a long moment. You had everything, Peter said quietly. Position, power, influence, but you forgot the most important thing I tried to teach you. Character matters more than success. Hank Brennan taught me that lesson in Vietnam. I'm sorry I failed to teach it to you. With those words, Peter Whitmore allowed his nurse to wheel him out of the courtroom, leaving behind a son who had finally been forced to face the true measure of his disgrace. Rebecca Brennan walked through the nearly empty courthouse parking garage, her heels echoing against the concrete. Her briefcase felt heavy, with the weight of evidence files documenting Judge Whitmore's corruption. The afternoon sun cast long shadows between the concrete pillars, and something about the emptiness made her nervous. The sound of footsteps behind her made her quicken her pace. She fumbled for her car keys, her heart pounding as the footsteps grew closer. Before she could reach her vehicle, 3 men in dark suits stepped out from behind a concrete pillar, blocking her path. "Miss Brennan," a smooth voice called out. Lito Caldwell emerged from the shadows, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the grimy parking garage. "We need to have a conversation about these unfortunate allegations you're spreading." Rebecca clutched her briefcase tighter. "Mr. Caldwell, any conversation can happen through our attorneys." Caldwell's polite smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm afraid this matter requires a more immediate resolution." He nodded to his men, who began moving closer. "You have some documents that could cause a lot of trouble for many important people. Hand them over, and we can all go home safely." "Stay back," Rebecca warned, though her voice trembled. She reached for her phone, but one of the men lunged forward and knocked it from her hand. It skittered across the concrete floor, disappearing under a nearby car. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Caldwell said, his facade of politeness cracking. "Give us the evidence and delete any copies you've made. Otherwise..." He let the threat hang in the air. The security team closed in. Rebecca backed away until she felt cold concrete against her spine. One of the men reached for her briefcase and she jerked it away, but another grabbed her arm roughly. "Let her go." The voice was quiet but commanding, echoing through the garage. Everyone turned to see Franco Brennan standing at the garage entrance. Despite his hospital gown visible under his jacket and the tremor in his hands, he stood straight and tall. Behind him, a group of veterans of various ages moved into view, some from his Vietnam era, others from more recent conflicts. "This doesn't concern you, old man," Caldwell sneered. "Go back to your hospital bed." Hank took a steady step forward, his bronze star gleaming on his jacket. "When you threaten my granddaughter, it becomes my concern." His voice grew stronger with each word. "When you try to hide your corruption through intimidation, it becomes the concern of every man who ever fought for justice in this country." The veterans spread out behind him, forming a protective line. Some walked with canes or limped from old wounds, but their faces showed the same determination that had carried them through battlefields across the world. "You're making a mistake," Caldwell warned, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice now. "The only mistake," Hank said, moving closer, "was thinking you could threaten a soldier's family and get away with it." His hands had stopped shaking. "I carried wounded men through enemy fire in Vietnam. You think your hired thugs scare me?" One of Caldwell's men made the mistake of grabbing Rebecca's briefcase. Before he could yank it away, a Vietnam-era veteran with a Marine Corps tattoo caught his arm. Another security guard threw a punch, but a younger veteran, his Iraq War Service evident in his bearing, blocked it and responded with military precision. The parking garage erupted into chaos. Caldwell's men might have been trained in security work, but they were facing men who had fought in jungles, deserts, and mountains. The veterans moved with the coordinated precision of those who had depended on each other in combat. Hank himself stood like a rock in the storm, protecting Rebecca as his brothers-in-arms handled the physical confrontation. When one of Caldwell's men tried to circle around toward them, Hank stepped forward and caught the man's wrist in a grip that belied his age. "I may be old," Hank said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of service, "but some things you never forget." With a twist learned in Army combat training half a century ago, he sent the younger man stumbling backward. The fight ended as quickly as it had begun. Caldwell's security team lay sprawled or kneeling on the concrete, while the veterans stood guard, barely winded. Caldwell himself had backed away, his confident facade shattered. "This isn't over," Caldwell threatened, but his voice cracked. "Yes, it is," Rebecca said, holding up her phone, the one that had skittered under the car. "I've been recording since you approached me. Attempted assault, conspiracy to destroy evidence, witness intimidation that should add some interesting charges to the corruption case." Caldwell's face went pale. He backed away, then turned and ran toward the garage exit. His security team scrambled to their feet and followed, leaving the veterans standing victorious in the dim garage light. Rebecca turned to her grandfather, who was now leaning heavily against a concrete pillar. The burst of strength that had carried him through the confrontation was fading, and his hands had begun to shake again. "Grandpa, you should be in the hospital," she said softly, supporting his arm. Hank smiled tiredly. "Probably. But a soldier never abandons his post when family needs him." He looked around at his fellow veterans, or his brothers. The other veterans gathered around him, offering support and steady hands. They had come when he called, just as they had always come when their country called. Different wars, different eras, but the same unwavering courage and loyalty. "Let's get you back to the hospital," Rebecca said, her voice thick with emotion. "Just a minute," Hank said. He straightened his jacket and touched his bronze star. "I want to thank my brothers here. You came when I needed you, just like we always did for each other." The veterans gathered closer, their faces showing the same mix of pride and determination that had carried them through their service. They had fought on different battlefields in different decades, but they shared the same core of honor that had brought them here today. "Semper Fi," the Marine veteran said. "No man left behind," added another. Rebecca watched as these warriors, young and old, surrounded her grandfather with the same solidarity that had saved lives on battlefields across time. In their presence, she saw the true meaning of the medal her grandfather wore, not just a symbol of past courage, but a living testament to the bonds that connected all those who served. Special Agent Sarah Martinez stood before the evidence board in the FBI field office, studying the web of connections that had emerged from Rebecca Brennan's evidence, Photos, documents, and sticky notes covered the board, all connected by red strings that traced the corruption back to Judge Preston Whitmore and Leto Caldwell. "We've got him," she said to her partner, Agent David Lopez, who was reviewing financial records at his desk. "Caldwell's singing like a bird since we picked him up. The parking garage incident was the last straw. He's terrified of going down alone." Lopez nodded, holding up a stack of papers. The bank records confirm everything. Regular payments from Caldwell's shell companies to offshore accounts linked to Whitmore. The judge was charging $50,000 per favorable ruling. Martinez turned back to the board, focusing on a new section that had caught her attention. "But there's something else here. Look at these case files." She pointed to a collection of court transcripts. "Whitmore's been systematically targeting veterans in his courtroom." "What do you mean?" Lopez asked, walking over to examine the transcripts. "Pattern of behavior. Every time a veteran appeared before him, especially those wearing service medals or decorations, Whitmore found ways to humiliate them." Martinez spread out several transcripts on a nearby table. He'd make them remove medals, question their service, impose harsher sentences than normal. The Brennan case wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern. The investigation team had spent weeks piecing together Whitmore's court records. What they found was disturbing. Dozens of cases where veterans faced unusual hostility from the judge. Traffic violations turned into contempt charges, minor infractions led to maximum penalties, and always, there was the same pattern of public humiliation. "We interviewed his former clerk," Lopez said, pulling out another file. "Says Whitmore would actually get excited when he saw a veteran was coming before his court. Called it taking them down a peg." Martinez picked up a different folder. "Whitmore's personal background check. I think I know why. Look at this. During Vietnam, Whitmore was draft age. His father served. Was a medic, actually. But Preston got a series of deferments. Claimed he had a bad knee, but there's no medical records to support it." "Guilt," Lopez said, understanding dawning on his face. He couldn't face his father's service, so he takes it out on other veterans. The evidence mounted as more victims came forward. Veterans organizations helped the FBI locate dozens of former service members who had faced Whitmore's particular brand of judicial abuse. Each story followed the same pattern: deliberate humiliation, excessive penalties, and a special hatred for those who displayed their military decorations. One afternoon, a week after Caldwell's arrest, Martinez interviewed Peter Whitmore in his nursing home. The elder Whitmore, still sharp despite his age, provided crucial insight into his son's behavior. "Preston was always ashamed," Peter said, his hands trembling slightly as he held a cup of tea. "When I came back from Vietnam, I tried to tell him about the men who served, their courage, their sacrifice, but he couldn't face it. Couldn't face that he had stayed home while others fought." "Did he ever talk about it?" Martinez asked gently. Peter nodded slowly. "Once, after too many drinks at a family dinner. Said he felt like a coward every time he saw a uniform or a medal. Said it made him angry, seeing others wear their service with pride when he had none of his own." The investigation uncovered more than just financial corruption. Whitmore had used his position to carry out a personal vendetta against the military community he secretly resented. Court records showed he had deliberately scheduled veterans' cases together, creating what he called in private emails his special sessions. "Look at this," Lopez said one morning, holding up a printed email. Message from Whitmore to his clerk. "Another medal-wearing hero coming in tomorrow. Let's see how brave he feels when I make him take it off in front of everyone." The evidence was damning. Beyond the bribes and corruption, Whitmore had abused his position to wage a personal war against veterans. Each new revelation added to the charges: judicial misconduct, abuse of power, violation of civil rights under color of law. Martinez stood before the evidence board again, adding the final pieces. The web of corruption had expanded beyond simple bribery. It told a story of a man whose own moral failures had twisted into a weapon against those who embodied the courage he lacked. "We're ready," she said to Lopez, who was preparing the arrest warrant. "Financial corruption, systematic discrimination, abuse of power, we've got it all." The investigation had revealed not just crimes, but a pattern of targeted cruelty born from one man's inability to face his own cowardice. What had started with Franco Brennan's Bronze Star had unraveled a decades-long campaign of judicial abuse against the veteran community. As Martinez gathered the final evidence for the prosecution, she paused at a photo of Franco Brennan in his Army uniform, taken decades ago in Vietnam. The same medal that Whitmore had ordered him to remove gleamed on his chest, a symbol of the very courage that had so threatened the corrupt judge. The case was ready. Whitmore's carefully constructed facade had crumbled, revealing the truth about both his financial corruption and his systematic targeting of veterans. The man who had hidden behind his judicial robes to attack those braver than himself would finally face justice. The federal courthouse buzzed with anticipation on a crisp autumn morning. The same marble halls that had witnessed Franco Brennan's humiliation now prepared to host both justice and redemption. Television cameras lined the steps outside, while inside, the main courtroom filled with veterans, reporters, and citizens who had followed the story from its beginning. Judge Sarah Martinez, specially appointed to handle the corruption case, sat straight-backed on the bench. Before her, Preston Whitmore stood in a plain suit, his previous arrogance replaced by defeated resignation. His attorney nervously shuffled papers beside him. "Will the defendant please rise?" the court clerk announced. Judge Martinez's voice carried clearly through the packed courtroom. "Preston Whitmore, this court finds you guilty of all charges. Your actions represent not only corruption of the highest order, but a betrayal of the very principles of justice you swore to uphold." She paused, her gaze stern. "You are hereby sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. You are immediately removed from the bench and will be disbarred from the practice of law. Furthermore, you will pay restitution to all veterans who suffered discrimination in your courtroom." In the gallery, Rebecca Brennan squeezed her grandfather's hand. Hank sat tall in his wheelchair, his mind clear today, watching justice unfold. The following week, Lito Caldwell received his sentence, 12 years for bribery, corruption, and attempted intimidation. His empire of corrupt dealings crumbled as federal investigators uncovered decades of illegal activities. But the true culmination came 3 months later, when the courthouse hosted a very different ceremony. The main courtroom had been transformed, with flags flanking the bench and military honors on display. Distinguished veterans filled the front rows, their medals gleaming under the lights. Franco Hank Brennan sat in his dress uniform, recently pressed for the occasion. Though his hands sometimes trembled and his memories often faded, today his eyes shone with perfect clarity. Rebecca stood behind his wheelchair, wearing her best suit, pride evident in every line of her face. The Secretary of the Army himself stood at the podium, holding a blue velvet case. "Today, we correct a long overdue oversight," he announced. "Through the diligence of his granddaughter and the testimony of his fellow soldiers, we have confirmed that Sergeant First Class Franco Brennan's actions in Vietnam warranted our nation's highest military honor." Peter Whitmore, supported by a nurse and using a walker, made his way slowly to the front. Though frail, his voice carried strongly as he read from the original recommendation letter he had written decades ago. On April 12, 1968, under heavy enemy fire, Sergeant Brennan repeatedly risked his own life to save 12 wounded men, including myself. He carried each soldier to safety, returning again and again into the killing zone until every man was rescued. His extraordinary heroism reflects the highest traditions of military service. Tears glinted in Peter's eyes as he reached Hank's wheelchair. The two old soldiers looked at each other, a lifetime of shared experience passing between them. With trembling but determined hands, Peter opened the velvet case and lifted out the Medal of Honor. "It was my honor to serve with you," Peter said softly, carefully pinning the medal to Hank's uniform. and it is my honor to finally see you receive the recognition you earned with your blood and courage." The two men saluted each other, then embraced as the room erupted in applause. Photographers captured the moment, not just of the medal ceremony, but of healing and redemption. Later, as the crowd mingled during the reception, Hank sat quietly with Rebecca in a corner of the courthouse lobby. His new Medal of Honor hung alongside his bronze star, both medals catching the afternoon light streaming through the high windows. "You know, sweetheart," he said, his voice clear and strong, "standing up for what's right never goes out of style." He patted her hand. "Sometimes the greatest victory isn't in the medals or the ceremonies. It's in refusing to surrender your dignity, no matter what comes your way." Rebecca wiped tears from her eyes. "You taught me that, Grandpa. Every day of my life." Peter Whitmore joined them, easing himself into a nearby chair. 3 generations sat together in the courthouse, where their story had begun. The 2 elderly veterans, who had shared the horror of war, and the young lawyer who had fought for justice in her own way. The afternoon sun streamed through the courthouse windows, highlighting the medals on Hank's chest, symbols not just of past heroism, but of dignity maintained and justice finally served. In that moment, the courthouse itself seemed transformed from a place of humiliation to a sanctuary of restored honor, where the truth had finally prevailed over corruption and cowardice. If this one resonated with you, stick around. I've got another story waiting for you tomorrow, and who knows, it might be just what you needed to hear.